Emily looked at her phone, which had just vibrated. A message. Do you really know where he is right now? Her heart froze. James, her husband, always said late-night calls were work. But lately, his excuses sounded too perfect. She shifted her gaze to the watch he had hastily left on the table before yet another business trip. The message was short but piercing. Who was it? And why did it feel like someone knew more than she did? She glanced at his laptop, still open. Something urged her to look at it. What would she find? And was she ready to find out? She left me for another man, but I proved that I'm always one step ahead. The story began on an ordinary evening in a small town. James Brooks, a successful businessman with a brilliant career and a picture-perfect family, was coming home after a long day at work. His wife, Emily, was waiting for him, as always, with a warm dinner and a charming smile. But this time, something was off. There was unease in her eyes, and her movements betrayed a nervousness he hadn't noticed before. "How was your day?" James asked, studying her face. "Everything's fine," she replied, avoiding his gaze. Her voice trembled slightly, but she quickly shifted her attention to the children playing in the living room. James felt that something wasn't right, but chose not to press. He knew life could be challenging at times, and perhaps this was just one of those days. However, his intuition, which had never failed him in business, whispered, "Dig for the truth." The following days were filled with small but troubling changes. Emily began staying late at work. Her phone was always nearby, but the screen was always dark. Her laughter, once a constant in their home, had become rare. James tried to ignore these changes, but his suspicions grew like a snowball. One evening, when Emily said she had plans to meet with friends, James decided to verify her words. He called Lori, her best friend, who was supposedly with her. Surprised, Lori said they hadn't seen each other in a long time. That same evening, James decided to follow Emily. He felt he needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. He watched as she left the house, dressed far more elegantly than usual, and got into her car. She drove to a restaurant where a man was waiting for her. It was Mark, her colleague. James watched from his car, feeling his heart shatter. He saw them laugh, saw Emily touch Mark's hand. In that moment, James's world began to crumble. But instead of acting impulsively, he decided to wait for the right moment. He needed more information to understand how far their relationship had gone. The next day, he hired a private investigator. The results of the investigation shocked him. Emily and Mark had been seeing each other for months. Their secret meetings were disguised as business trips and outings with friends. James felt anger and pain, but at the same time, a competitive spirit awakened within him. He decided he wouldn't let her destroy their life so easily. Once he had all the evidence he needed, James devised a plan. He was going to show Emily that her betrayal hadn't gone unnoticed. That evening, when she returned home, he was waiting with all the evidence. But instead of causing a scene, he said only one thing: "Emily, you've made your choice. Now it's my turn." James Brooks was not a man who gave up easily. He knew the game had begun, and he needed to stay ahead to maintain control. A single thought stood out in his mind: they don't know who they're dealing with. The next morning, James arrived at his office earlier than usual. His assistant, Sarah, surprised by his early appearance, asked, "Is everything all right, Mr. Brooks?" "Yes, Sarah. I need a full financial report on the company Mark Henderson works for. And find me contacts of people who might provide information about him," he said, his tone so cold and resolute that Sarah realized this was something serious. In the following days, James immersed himself in the investigation. He discovered that Mark's reputation was far from spotless. There had been several incidents where his actions nearly caused project failures. But these were just the tip of the iceberg. Digging deeper, James uncovered traces of financial fraud. Mark had been using company funds for personal expenses, disguising them as client-related costs. James couldn't allow his wife to be associated with such a man. But before taking action, he decided to set a trap. He invited Mark to a business party he was hosting under the guise of forming new partnerships. Emily, of course, didn't know Mark had been invited, and James decided this moment would be decisive. At the party, James was in his element, confident, charming, impeccably dressed. He watched as Mark entered the room with a smile, unaware of the trap. Emily visibly tensed upon seeing Mark. James, as if nothing had happened, approached Mark and greeted him warmly. "Mark, glad you could make it. I've heard you're a real professional in your field," James said with a smile, though his eyes remained cold. Mark, unaware he had been exposed, replied, "Thank you, James. Your reputation speaks for itself as well." The evening went on, and James slowly led Mark into revealing his true colors. The climax came when James, in the presence of several influential businessmen, presented evidence of Mark's financial fraud. Documents, testimonies, even photos. Everything was laid out with flawless precision. Emily stood off to the side, her face pale as she realized her secret affair was unraveling before her eyes. Mark, humiliated and flustered, tried to defend himself, but his arguments sounded pitiful. After the party, James approached Emily, who was trying to find the right words. He didn't give her a chance to justify herself. "Emily, I didn't do this to humiliate you. I wanted to show you that I know the truth. You made your choice, and now that choice has consequences," he said, leaving her standing alone in the half-empty hall. That night, Emily was left alone in their big house. She didn't know what would come next. James didn't come home, and her phone remained silent. Her world began to crumble, but she couldn't figure out what hurt more: the exposure of her betrayal or the fact that James still remained stronger than her. Emily couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, and her heart was heavy with bitterness. All the memories, the happy moments with James, their dreams and plans now seemed distant and unattainable. But she wasn't ready to give up. For the first time in a long while, she decided to fight. Early in the morning, she got dressed, putting on her best suit, and headed to James's office. He needed to see that she was willing to do whatever it took to fix her mistakes. But when she entered his office, she saw him with another woman. A tall, stylish blonde with a confident gaze stood next to James, leaning over his desk. "Emily, what are you doing here?" James asked, looking up. There wasn't a trace of warmth in his voice. "We need to talk," she said, trying not to look at the woman who seemed to have already taken her place. "You'll have to wait." "I'm in a meeting," he replied curtly, turning his attention back to the blonde. Emily felt her heart tighten, but she held herself together. She sat in the corridor, waiting. Each minute felt like an eternity until James finally came out. "Can we talk now?" she asked, looking him straight in the eyes. "If this is another attempt to justify yourself, don't bother," he replied coldly. "No, it's not an excuse. I want to make things right. James, I know I made a mistake, but I'm ready to change, ready to fight for us," she said, her voice trembling but holding back tears. "Emily, you've lost your chance. I can't trust you anymore. And, honestly, I'm not sure I want to," he said, his words cutting like a knife. She left his office humiliated, but not broken. She knew she had to act. Emily began searching for ways to regain his trust. She sent him letters of apology, tried to remind him of their happy moments, and even organized a dinner at the restaurant where they had celebrated their wedding anniversary. But James remained unyielding. One evening, when he came home, he found Emily in their living room. She was sitting with a photo album of their travels. Her face was sad but determined. "James, I know you can't forget what happened, but I want you to remember what we had. We were happy, and I'm willing to do anything to bring that back," she said, her voice filled with pain and hope. "Emily, it's not that simple. Trust is something you destroyed, and I'm not sure I can rebuild it," he replied. Their conversation lasted late into the night. She pleaded, explained, and tried to reach his heart, but James remained firm. It seemed as if an invisible wall stood between them, impossible to break. The next day, Emily received an anonymous message. "Your husband isn't as perfect as you think. Want to know more? Meet me at the cafe on the corner of Baker and Pine at 6 p.m. She wasn't sure if she should go, but curiosity won. At the cafe, Mark was waiting for her. He looked worn out, but his eyes burned with hatred. "You think James is a saint? Think again. I can tell you things that will shatter your perception of him," he said, smiling. Emily couldn't believe she now found herself in a situation where her enemy became her ally. Her heart raced as she listened to Mark's words. He told her about James's business dealings, about deals that weren't as clean as they seemed. But was it true? Emily left the cafe feeling even more confused. She realized her battle had just become even more complicated. Emily sat in her bedroom, pondering Mark's words. She couldn't believe that James, her James, could be involved in anything illegal. But deep down, she knew Mark wasn't one to speak idly. She needed to verify it. She began by reviewing financial documents left at home. She had always known James to be meticulous in business matters, but now she was looking for even the smallest inconsistencies. However, there was nothing suspicious. Her only chance was to gain access to his office computer. The next morning, after James left for a meeting, Emily went to his office. She turned to Sarah, his assistant, for help. "Sarah, this is very important. I want to surprise James, but I need access to his computer. This has to stay between us," she said, hoping her charm and desperation would persuade the woman. Sarah hesitated, but eventually agreed. She opened the office door and left Emily alone. Emily quickly turned on the computer and started going through the files. What she found made her heart stop. The documents contained records of accounts opened offshore. Large sums of money were being transferred to unknown companies. But that wasn't all. Emily found correspondence mentioning influential people and deals that were clearly outside the law. It seemed James was playing a dangerous game with stakes that were far too high. But that wasn't the worst part. Among the files, she found a folder with her name on it. Inside were photographs, photos of her and Mark. It turned out James had known about their affair much earlier than she had imagined. He had been gathering evidence, but why had he remained silent? Emily felt a wave of panic. She hurried to close the computer, but at that moment, the office door opened. It was James. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with anger. "What are you doing here, Emily?" he asked coldly, closing the door behind him. I wanted to understand what's going on. I know about the accounts, James, and about these deals." Her voice trembled, but she tried to sound resolute. James stepped closer, his stance intimidating. "And what are you planning to do with this information? Share it with Mark? Or perhaps the police?" "James, this is wrong. You've gotten yourself into something dangerous." "I want to help you," she said, reaching out, but he stepped back. "You've helped enough, Emily. I knew about you and Mark, and I knew this moment would come. But you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." His voice was cold, with an undertone of menace. Emily realized James was prepared to do whatever it took to protect himself. She left the office feeling trapped. Now she knew too much but was powerless. That evening, she received another message from Mark. "I can help you get out of this, but we need to act fast." Emily realized she was caught between two men, each with their secrets and motives. She could trust no one anymore. Emily was awakened by a knock on the door. It was early, the sun barely rising over the horizon, when she saw a car parked outside her house. A man in a dark suit with a briefcase stood at the door. Anxiety filled her even before she opened it. "Mrs. Brooks?" he asked in an official tone. "Yes, that's me." "Who are you?" she replied, trying to remain calm. "My name is Henry Vale. I'm your husband's attorney. I have documents for you to sign," he said, handing her a folder. Emily opened the folder and saw divorce papers. Her hands trembled. "What is this? Why is he doing this now?" she whispered, not looking up. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm simply following instructions. Your husband wishes to resolve this quickly and without unnecessary scandal. Signing these documents will help avoid further complications." His voice was devoid of emotion. Emily realized James had decided to play hardball. Not only was he filing for divorce, but he was doing it in a way that would isolate her from any resources. She felt her world crumbling. She sent the attorney away, promising to think about it, but she knew this was just the beginning. That same day, she tried calling her friends, but most of them were suddenly unavailable. A few short conversations were filled with polite but cold excuses. She realized James had used his influence to isolate her socially. Left without support, Emily turned to Mark. He was the only one who would still listen. "Emily, I warned you. James isn't who he pretends to be. He knows how to manipulate people," Mark said when they met in a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. "Mark, I don't know what to do." He controls everything. My friends are too scared even to talk to me, Emily said, allowing herself to cry for the first time in a long time. I'll help you. But you have to trust me, he said softly, though a steely determination glinted in his eyes. Mark proposed a plan. They decided to find a way to access information that could expose James to everyone. To do this, Emily needed to meet with him again and try to extract details about his dealings. The next day, Emily went to James's office. He was surprised to see her, but he didn't show it. What are you doing here, Emily? We've already settled everything. His voice was cold as ice. I want to talk. Maybe we can find a compromise. She tried to sound as convincing as possible. James looked at her carefully. He knew Emily wasn't one to give up easily. A compromise? After everything that's happened? You want to rebuild trust? That's impossible, he said, rising from his seat. James, please. I know I made a mistake, but that doesn't give you the right to destroy my life. Her voice trembled, but she stood her ground. Emily, your life is a result of your decisions. And now you're reaping what you sowed, he said, stepping closer, his eyes radiating resolve. She realized she couldn't reach him with words, but she noticed something on his desk, a folder of documents. Pretending to cry to distract him, she discreetly took a few photos of the documents with her phone. When she returned to Mark, they began analyzing what she had managed to obtain. The documents contained information about transactions pointing to James's involvement in illegal activities. However, they lacked concrete proof to confirm it. Mark held the phone in his hand, scrolling through the photos Emily had taken. An idea formed in his mind, one he believed could turn the situation to their advantage. But it was a dangerous game. Emily, this is your chance to set things right. We can make James pay for what he's done, he said, handing her the phone. Emily, sitting across from him, felt a mix of emotions. Mark, are you sure? This could make everything even worse. Trust me. If we play our cards right, he'll be forced to meet our terms. His confidence was almost convincing. Mark decided to start with a message. He sent James a photo with a single line. I know what you're hiding. Time to negotiate. The response didn't take long. James called within minutes. What does this mean, Mark? His voice was cold but calm. It means I know about your deals, James. And if you don't want this to go public, we need to meet, Mark replied. James paused. Fine. Tomorrow at 7 in the evening. Name the place. The next day, Mark and Emily arrived at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. James was already waiting for them. He looked confident, but Emily noticed the tension in his eyes. Mark, you don't understand what you've gotten yourself into, James said, crossing his arms. Do you think you can blackmail me? I don't think, James. I know, Mark replied, handing him printouts of the document photos. This is just a fraction of what I have. James smiled. You underestimate me, Mark. Do you really think I would leave behind evidence that could destroy me? Emily, standing off to the side, felt the tension between the men escalate. She tried to remain calm, but her heart was pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Maybe you have better cards than I thought, James said. But you also forget that I know your little secrets, Mark, like your debts and the real reason you worked with Emily. Mark paled. You're bluffing. Am I? Let's think about this. You want me to pay for your silence? What if instead, I make you the prime suspect in this whole affair? James stepped forward, his voice turning threatening. Emily sensed the situation spiraling out of control. James, this won't solve anything. We've all made mistakes. But you can stop now while there's still a chance. A chance? For what, Emily? To save you? Do you think that's what I want after everything that's happened? His words were like a slap in the face. Mark, seeing Emily beginning to falter, tried to intervene. James, if you want to play hardball, fine. But remember, I'm not giving up. All right, James said, smiling. Let's see who loses first. But remember, Mark, I'm always one step ahead. As they left the warehouse, Emily felt that everything had gone wrong. She noticed Mark hiding the trembling of his hands. What aren't you telling me, Mark? She asked. It's not that simple, Emily. He has people. People who can do anything to us. He looked genuinely afraid. That night, Emily was left alone. She began to realize that Mark wasn't who he seemed to be. She recalled James's words about Mark's debts and started to suspect she was being used. But could she trust James after everything that had happened? Emily woke up in the darkness, reflecting on the events of the past few days. A sense of unease lingered. Something about Mark's behavior didn't sit right with her. She decided to act on her own, even if it meant taking risks. She started by going through her phone. There were messages from Mark, but one seemed strange. It was a short text, "Don't worry, everything's under control. Tonight." She didn't understand what it meant, but decided to find out. Emily knew Mark often met with his partners at a nightclub downtown. She headed there, bringing a hidden camera with her. When she entered the club, her eyes quickly adjusted to the darkness, and she spotted Mark at a table in the back. Sitting next to him was a tall man in an expensive suit who exuded confidence and danger. She moved closer to eavesdrop on their conversation. "You know James isn't the main target. We're just using him to get to the bigger prize," said the stranger. "I understand, but Emily could complicate things." "She knows too much," Mark replied. "Then make sure she stays out of it. If not, we'll handle it another way." The stranger's voice was calm, but it carried a veiled threat. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She realized she was part of a larger game than she had imagined. She took a few steps back, trying to remain unnoticed, but her heel caught on the carpet. The stranger immediately looked in her direction. "Who's there?" he asked, rising from his seat. Emily quickly turned and walked toward the exit, trying not to attract attention. She made it outside and ran to her car. Her hands trembled as she started the engine. When she got home, Mark called her. "Were you there?" His voice was sharp. "Yes, and now I know you're working for someone else." "Who is that man, Mark? And what are you really planning?" Her voice was filled with anger. "Emily, it's not what you think. I'm trying to protect you," he tried to justify himself. "Protect me? You dragged me into this game and didn't even warn me." "Who is he, Mark?" she pressed. "His name is Vincent. He's one of the most powerful men in the city. If you cross him, it could end badly," Mark replied, avoiding details. Emily realized she couldn't trust Mark. She decided to find a way to meet with James and warn him, even if it meant facing his anger again. The next day, she went to James's office. His assistant was surprised to see her, but allowed her into his office. "What are you doing here, Emily?" James asked as she entered. "I found out something you need to know. It's about Mark and his bosses. They're using you in their game," she said quickly. "And why should I believe you? After everything that's happened?" His voice was cold. "Because you know I wouldn't make this up. James, they're planning something big, and you're just a part of their scheme." Her words were sincere. James thought for a moment. "Fine. If you're telling the truth, I'll find out what's going on. But if this is another one of your games, you'll regret it." Emily felt the situation growing even more complicated. She was caught between two men, each with their own secrets and motives. But the scariest part was that she could only trust herself. Mark sat in his small apartment, scrolling through his phone. He dialed Vincent's number several times, but canceled the call each time. His hands were trembling, and his heart was racing so fast he could barely breathe. He knew his next move could change everything. On his phone screen was a message from Emily. "Mark, we need to talk. I know what you're up to." He smiled, but it was a nervous smile. She was always one step ahead. He finally called Vincent. "We need to meet." "There's something you need to know," Mark said into the phone. "You'd better not disappoint me, Mark," Vincent replied coldly. Mark knew he was playing with fire, but he also understood he couldn't allow himself to remain a pawn in Vincent's game. He had his own plan. When he arrived at the meeting, Vincent was sitting at his usual table in a dimly lit restaurant. His eyes radiated danger, and his smile promised nothing good. "What do you have for me?" Vincent asked, lighting a cigar. "James knows about us, but I have an idea how to outmaneuver him and keep our positions," Mark began, trying to appear confident. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Vincent leaned in closer, his voice quieter, but even more menacing. "I'm ready to hand Emily over to you. She's the key to James. She knows more than it seems, and she could become our weapon against him." Mark spoke quickly, trying to convince Vincent. "Emily? Are you sure she's worth it?" Vincent looked intrigued but unconvinced. "Absolutely. She's already on the verge of breaking. She'll be easy to use. And once she's yours, James will no longer be a problem. Mark smirked boldly, but inside, he was gripped with fear. Vincent thought for a moment. Fine, but if you fail me, Mark, it'll be your last mistake. Mark left the restaurant feeling as though he had made a deal with the devil. But he had his own plan. He knew Vincent wouldn't let him live if things went wrong, so he decided to act preemptively. The next day, he met with Emily. She was waiting for him at a cafe, her face focused, but her eyes burned with determination. "Mark, what have you done?" she asked as soon as he sat down. "I handed you over to Vincent," he said bluntly, looking her in the eye. "But don't worry, it's part of the plan." "The plan? Do you even understand what you've done? Vincent won't stop until he destroys us both." Her voice was filled with anger and fear. "I know, but I have something that will make him reconsider. I have evidence that can destroy his empire," Mark said, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "And what are you planning to do with it?" Emily asked, trying to understand his intentions. "We'll give it to James. He's the only one who can stand up to Vincent," Mark replied. Emily didn't trust Mark, but she realized they had no choice. She agreed to his plan, though deep down she felt this was only the beginning of even bigger problems. They handed the flash drive to James that evening. He took it without a word, but his gaze spoke volumes. "I'll take care of it," he said before leaving. But the next morning, the news reported an explosion at the building housing Vincent's office. Police claimed it was an accident, but Emily knew it was something more. She called Mark, but his phone was disconnected. She realized his plan had spiraled out of control. The smoke from the explosion hadn't even cleared when Vincent opened his eyes. His body ached, but he was alive. His guards had managed to get him out through the back exit, but now he sat in a dark basement, his face bloodied, and his eyes blazing with fury. He knew this wasn't an accident. Someone wanted him dead, and now he was determined to destroy everyone involved. While Emily tried to piece together the recent events, her phone suddenly rang. She picked it up, and a familiar voice came through on the other end. "Emily, you know who I am. Now it's your turn to explain why you decided to interfere in my affairs." Vincent's voice was as cold as a blade. "Vincent? You're alive." Her voice trembled, but she tried to stay calm. "Alive. And now I want to know who's behind this. You, Mark, or James? Maybe all three." His tone was threatening. Emily didn't know how to respond. "I didn't know anything about the explosion. I only found out about it from the news," she tried to explain, but she felt her words didn't convince him. "This is your last warning, Emily. If I find out you're playing against me, it will be your last mistake," Vincent said before hanging up. Emily realized she was now in a deadly trap. She tried calling James, but his phone was also off. She decided to find Mark. When she arrived at his apartment, the door was ajar. She walked in and saw Mark sitting at a table with a gun in his hand. "Mark, what are you doing?" she asked, cautiously approaching him. "Vincent's alive. I knew this would happen. I've lost, Emily. We've all lost." His voice was filled with despair. "No, we can still fix this. We need to come together." "Vincent cannot win," she said, placing her hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "You don't understand, Emily. He knows everything about me. He knows I tried to betray him. Now he won't stop until he destroys us all." Mark looked up at her, his eyes full of fear. Emily couldn't let him break. "Mark, we need to find a way to stop him. I'll find out where he is, and we'll prepare. But you can't give up now." The next few hours were spent planning their next moves. Emily managed to find out that Vincent was hiding out at one of his safe houses outside the city. They decided to gather evidence that could expose his connections and crimes. When they arrived at the safe house, everything seemed quiet. But as they stepped inside, they were met by Vincent. He stood in the center of the room, holding a gun. "I've been expecting you," he said with a smile. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" Mark tried to say something, but Vincent raised a hand, silencing him. "You both played a game you didn't understand. But now the game is over." Emily felt her heart tighten with fear. She knew this could be the end. But just as Vincent took a step toward them, police sirens blared outside. Vincent turned, giving Emily the chance to grab the gun from his hand. As the police arrested Vincent, Emily and Mark stood aside, realizing this was far from over. Dusk settled over the city when Emily received an envelope from an unknown sender. There was no signature, just the words, "Read this and decide if you're ready to see the truth." Inside was a set of clear instructions. Come to the old warehouse on the south side at midnight. Your life depends on it. Emily felt a wave of fear wash over her. She knew Vincent was in prison, but the envelope had his hallmark, cryptic, threatening, and inevitable. She didn't know what to expect, but she decided to take the risk. She called Mark, but his phone was silent. James was also unreachable. She was on her own. When she arrived at the warehouse, the old doors creaked open before her. Inside, it was dark, with only a single table in the center lit by a lamp. On the table was a recorder. Emily pressed the play button. Emily, if you're listening to this, it means you came. You've always been curious. Vincent's voice was calm but commanding. Do you think I'm defeated? No, the game has just begun. His voice continued. I knew they would try to destroy me, but my plans are always several steps ahead. You, James, Mark, you're all part of the game now. But you're the key, Emily. You have a choice. Either you become my ally, or, his voice paused, or you lose everything. Think about it. You have until dawn. And by the way, say hello to Mark. Emily felt her heart race. Vincent knew she would come and knew she would listen. But what did he mean by mentioning Mark? As she left the warehouse, she saw a shadow a few steps away from her car. It was Mark. His face was haggard, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Emily, what are you doing here? He asked, though he seemed just as surprised to see her. I got a letter. Did you? She asked, trying to read the truth in his eyes. Mark didn't answer. He simply stepped closer and said, I don't think Vincent ever leaves loose ends. We're all part of his plan now. Emily felt a surge of anxiety. What do you mean? Are you working for him? No, Mark replied, but his voice trembled. But I made a mistake. He knew I'd try to play against him, and now I think we're all playing by his rules. They decided to return to Mark's apartment to figure out their next steps. But when they arrived, there was already a new note on the table. You think you can hide? My eyes are everywhere. Emily and Mark realized that even from prison, Vincent had access to resources that allowed him to maintain control. By morning, Emily decided to call James, who finally answered. His voice was anxious. Emily, I think we need to meet. I got a message from Vincent. He knows something about me that I wouldn't want you to know. The confession caught her off guard. What do you mean, James? What does he know? She asked, her voice rising with emotion. Let's meet. I'll explain, he said. Emily knew this was only the beginning of an even more complex game, where she was just another piece on the board. But how to play next? She hadn't yet decided. Emily sat in her apartment, staring at a map she found in the note. It marked a warehouse in the industrial zone outside the city. Her heart pounded, but she knew waiting was no longer an option. If she wanted to escape this maze of intrigue and betrayal, she had to act alone. She dressed in dark clothing, grabbed a flashlight, and took a hidden camera as her insurance. The drive to the warehouse took about an hour, and the entire time, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The streets were dark, and every sound made her jump. She parked her car a few blocks away to stay unnoticed. When she reached the warehouse, it looked abandoned. Large iron doors were locked, but Emily found a small window through which she could slip inside. She carefully climbed through, trying to stay quiet. Inside, the warehouse was empty except for a few old crates and a table strewn with papers. She turned on her flashlight and cautiously examined the room. The table held documents, but everything looked as if someone had left in a hurry. Among the papers, she found several contracts and photographs. The photos showed James and Vincent together. Emily felt her breath catch. She couldn't understand how her husband could be involved in all of this. Next to the photos were documents pointing to financial fraud, smuggling, and even conspiracies with politicians. Suddenly, she heard a noise. Someone had entered the warehouse. She quickly turned off her flashlight and hid behind one of the crates. Within seconds, 2 men walked in. One of them was Vincent. This place needs to be cleaned. We can't leave any traces, Vincent said coldly. We've already moved everything. But if someone finds this place, it could be a problem, his companion replied. That's why we'll burn it. By tomorrow, there will be nothing left but ashes, Vincent answered with a malicious smile. Emily could barely breathe. She realized that if she stayed any longer, she might be discovered. She quietly took out her phone and snapped a few photos of Vincent and his companion. But as she tried to move away, her phone slipped from her hand, making a noise. Who's there? Vincent demanded sharply, turning toward her. Emily bolted toward the exit, but one of the men spotted her. There she is. Get her, he shouted. Emily ran as fast as she could. She climbed out through the window and dashed toward her car. She knew they were chasing her but didn't stop. When she reached the road, she saw a car approaching. Waving her arms, she tried to flag it down. It was James. His face was tense. Emily, what are you doing here? He asked as she jumped into the car. Vincent. He's here. We need to go, she shouted. James hit the gas, and the car sped away. They drove in silence for several minutes until Emily finally collected her thoughts. I found evidence, James. I know you worked with Vincent. What are you hiding? Her voice was filled with pain and anger. James was silent, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. It's not what you think, he said finally. I was trying to protect us. But now, everything is out of control. Emily realized they were both now entangled in a game with no easy way out. She would have to decide whether to trust James or seek help elsewhere. Emily sat in a hotel room, laying out the documents she had found. Her hands trembled as she examined the cryptic records. Some mentioned names of high-ranking officials, corporations, and even governments in various countries. But what shocked her most was the word alliance, which appeared repeatedly. It sounded like a code name, but she felt it represented something far more significant. She called James. I found something big. You need to get here immediately, she said, her voice tense. Emily, you have no idea what you've stumbled into, James replied. The alliance is bigger than Vincent. It's bigger than both of us. I'm on my way. Be careful. She hung up and continued going through the documents. On one of the pages was a list of bank transfers, with sums exceeding millions of dollars. The ultimate recipient was an account in a Swiss bank linked to a company she had never heard of. When James arrived, his face was strained. He silently looked through the documents before finally speaking. This changes everything. The alliance isn't just an organization. It's an international network controlling politics, finance, and even media. Vincent is just their tool. But if these documents fall into the right hands, we could destroy them. Emily felt a mix of fear and determination. We have to act, she said. But who can we trust? There's a journalist named Alex Reed. He's been trying to expose the alliance for years. If we can reach him, this could be our chance, James replied. The next day, they met Alex at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Alex was a middle-aged man with a tired but determined expression. He listened intently to their story and reviewed the documents. This is a gold mine, he said, holding one of the folders. But you realize your targets now? They won't stop at anything to bury this. Emily felt a cold sweat on her skin. What do we do? She asked. We need to act quickly. I know people who can help publish this data, but we'll need to stay under the radar, Alex said. Their conversation was interrupted when unfamiliar men filled the cafe. Emily noticed two of them watching their table intently. She whispered to James, We've been found. We need to go. Alex quickly stuffed the documents into his backpack, and the three of them slipped out through the back exit. But they were already being watched. One of the men drew a weapon, and a chase ensued. Emily ran as fast as she could, hearing bullets whistle past her. They managed to hide in an abandoned building. Alex clutched the backpack as if it were his lifeline. That was too close, he said, trying to catch his breath. What's next? Emily asked. I'll contact my people, but we need to split up. If they find us all together, it's over, Alex replied. Emily and James agreed. They knew they were now part of a game far beyond their understanding, but they also knew stopping would mean losing. Emily tried not to think about the danger as she sat in a dark corner of a small cafe. Alex had said the place was safe, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She sipped her coffee slowly, feeling the eyes of strangers on her back. James had taken another route to confuse their pursuers, leaving her alone. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Step outside. You know what to do. Emily shivered but obeyed. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the cafe, cautiously scanning her surroundings. On the sidewalk stood a man in a dark coat, leaning slightly against a car. When he saw Emily, his face remained expressionless, but his eyes carried an intense sternness. "Emily?" he asked in a low voice. She nodded. "Who are you?" she asked, trying not to show fear. "My name isn't important. I work for the Alliance, and I'm not here to harm you. At least, not if you're willing to listen," he replied. His words were sharp and precise, like a knife. Emily felt her body tense. "What do you want?" "You have documents we need. The Alliance is willing to leave you alone if you hand them over. This is your chance to get out of this alive." The man stepped closer, his voice softening but no less menacing. "And if I refuse?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Then you become our target. And believe me, we know how to make people reconsider." His faint smile was icy, cutting through her resolve. Emily lowered her gaze. "Why are these documents so important to you?" The man sighed, as if briefly allowing himself to show weariness. "They could destroy what the Alliance has built over decades. And it's not just about money or power. It's a structure that controls the global order. If this data falls into the wrong hands, it could unleash chaos." Emily realized her choice was far more complex than it seemed. She could save her life, but at what cost? "I'll think about it," she said finally. The man nodded. "You have 24 hours. We'll know your answer. And remember, we're always watching." As he walked away, Emily felt her legs trembling. She returned to the cafe but found no comfort there. Alex hadn't returned, and her mind was racing. She knew she had to make a decision. The next day, she met James in an old park where they used to spend evenings together. He looked exhausted, but his eyes burned with determination. "Emily, we can't give them those documents. This is our only chance to expose them," he said. "And what if they find us? They know everything about us, James. They know where we are, who we talk to. How can we fight against such power?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to stay calm. "We have to trust Alex. He's the only one who can help us," James said. "But it means we have to risk everything." Emily thought for a moment. She knew James was right, but her fear was overwhelming. Could she risk everything for justice? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind them. She turned to see two strangers in black approaching. "They're here," she whispered, grabbing James's hand. "We have to go." Emily sat in a small motel room, staring out the window at the pale glow of a street lamp. James tried to reassure her, but the tension between them was mounting. Both knew their time was running out. They couldn't hide forever, and the documents in Alex's possession were either the key to destroying the Alliance or their downfall. The door suddenly opened, and Alex entered the room. His clothes were wrinkled, his face weary, but his eyes burned with resolve. He tossed a black folder onto the table and said, "I have a plan, but you're not going to like it." "What do you mean?" James asked, lifting his head, suspicion lacing his voice. "This is our only chance to bring them into the light," Alex said, leaning back against the wall. "We can publish this data through one of the world's largest media platforms. But we need access that I don't have." Emily listened intently, her anxiety growing. "What kind of access?" Alex looked directly at her. "You have a contact in the media who used to work with Vincent. He trusts you. If you can convince him to help, we'll have a chance." "Do you mean Matthew?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "He betrayed me. I can't trust him anymore." "We're not asking for trust," Alex replied. "We're asking you to use him. He's your only key to these platforms. And if he sees you're willing to make a sacrifice, he'll support us." James sprang to his feet. "This is insane. You want her to risk her life for some traitor?" "If we don't do this, we'll lose everything," Alex responded coldly. "The Alliance moves faster than we can imagine. If we don't act first, they'll find us and destroy us." Emily clasped her hands tightly, trying to calm herself. She remembered Matthew, the man who once worked with Vincent but betrayed her when she needed him the most. Her heart ached, but she knew Alex was right. "Fine," she said finally. I'll talk to him, but if he betrays me again, we won't let that happen, Alex interrupted. I'll be nearby, but you have to do this yourself. He only trusts you. The next day, Emily went to the place where Matthew was working undercover. It was a small office in an old building. She took a deep breath and walked in. Matthew looked up, surprised to see her, and his face froze with a mix of shock and fear. Emily? What are you doing here? He asked, but his voice betrayed his unease. We need to talk, she said firmly. I know you worked with Vincent, but now I have information that could change everything. And I know you can help. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. Do you understand what you're asking? If Vincent finds out, he already knows about us, Emily interrupted. The question is whether you're ready to act. Either you help us expose the alliance, or you remain part of this system. Matthew was silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he said, All right, but I'm doing this to end this nightmare. When they returned to the motel, Alex and James were already waiting for them. We're running out of time, Alex said, glancing at his watch. We have to act tonight. They devised a plan. Matthew would use his access to the media platform to publish the documents, but it required Emily to distract the alliance agents, who they knew were already watching them. That evening, Emily dressed in dark clothing and went to meet with the alliance agents she knew were nearby. She had to play her role to draw them away from the location where Matthew and Alex were working on the publication. At the meeting with the agents, her heart pounded so loudly she thought they could hear it. I'm ready to make a deal, she said, trying to sound convincing. A wise choice, one of them said, though his eyes betrayed his mistrust. Emily managed to stall them long enough for Alex and Matthew to finish their work. But as she finally left, she found herself surrounded. One of the agents pulled out a phone and said, You made a mistake, and now you'll pay for it. Emily felt her heart race as the alliance agents closed in on her. Their eyes were cold with determination, and her fear grew with every passing second. She knew there was no escape, but her thoughts were focused on Matthew, Alex, and James. Would they finish their mission in time? You've made a grave error, Emily, one of the agents said, holding a device resembling a phone. Your friends are about to be just as defenseless as you. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steel herself. You can kill me, but it's too late. Your secrets will be exposed, she said, staring directly into the leader's eyes. Before the agent could reply, gunshots rang out. The warehouse doors burst open, and James and Alex stormed in. Their faces were set with determination, weapons in hand. Emily, get down, James shouted, opening fire on the agents. Emily dropped to the floor, taking cover behind a large crate. Bullets whizzed overhead as the sound of battle filled the room. James and Alex worked as a team. Alex provided cover while James fired with precision, taking down agents one by one. But the alliance agents didn't give up. One of them threw a smoke grenade, quickly filling the room with thick gray smoke. We need to find Emily and get out of here, Alex yelled, grabbing James by the shoulder. Emily tried not to panic, feeling her way through the smoke. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed her wrist. Got her, a voice shouted. She struggled to break free, but the man was much stronger. Suddenly, another gunshot rang out behind her, and the agent collapsed, letting go of her wrist. James stepped forward, his face tense but his eyes filled with determination. Are you okay? He asked, helping her to her feet. Yes, but we need to get out of here, Emily replied. They rushed toward the exit together, where Alex was already waiting for them in the car. Get in, he shouted, and they quickly climbed in. As they drove off, they saw more alliance agents emerging from the building. We can't just leave them like that, James said, glancing over his shoulder. We have another plan, Alex replied, pointing to the laptop on the back seat. Matthew finished the upload. All the data is already online. Emily felt a mix of relief and fear. Now they won't stop until they find us, she said. Alex smirked. But now they'll have to fight on a different battlefield. We've exposed them to the entire world. The car sped down the road, and in the distance, police sirens wailed. News broadcasts were already flooded with revelations about the alliance, its connections, and its crimes. But this was only part of the victory. Emily knew her life would never be the same again. When they stopped at a safe location, Alex looked at Emily and James. "We did it. But now it's up to the people to hear the truth." Emily reflected as she watched the sunrise. She felt proud that she had risked everything for justice, but her heart was weighed down by the question. Was it worth all the sacrifices? A question for the listener. Would you be willing to risk everything for the truth, knowing it could destroy your life?